My name is Chris Myers, and this is an interview for Mining Memories on the 14th of November 2012 with
Tonya Outram.
And our interviewee is Anne Cave. Can you tell us where you were born, please?
I was actually born in West Bridgford in Nottingham, which is just on the outskirts of Nottingham, and nothing appertaining to mining at all there.
When was it?
In 1954.
Okay. When did you get into the mining community?
We moved into Carlton, which again is a suburb of Nottingham, but it's on the edge of, where we lived was on the edge of Gedling and Netherfield. Gedling Colliery was a big colliery, and it affected everybody's lives in that area, and I was about 2 at the time.
Okay.
Did you find that you had particular memories of that as a child, or?
Yes, because not at the age of 2, I don't think I remembered much, but it was my formative years, if you like. So yeah, I've got quite a lot of memories of that, and several of my childhood friends' fathers were colliers. So
do you remember when they sort of happy memories, or do you remember their fathers, coming in from work and seeing a lot of them, or did you sort of play around the mines, or?
When I was very small, we weren't allowed to go anywhere, off the street, so to speak. It was quite a steep hill, and we lived 3/4 of the way up. So all us kids would play on the street because there weren't many cars. My dad was a motor mechanic. He'd been in the Remy, and he had set up his own business at this time. So we were poor as church mice. But that didn't matter because everybody was. At that time, miners weren't particularly well paid. And the other main industry was in the lace-making factories. So everybody was quite poor. Social life centred around the Working Men's Club and the local pub, but it was only a once or twice a week tops visit, and the ladies never seemed to go. The ladies were all a bit like Nora Batty, with the pinnies and the headscarves on. One old lady in particular, she would have been in her 60s, I think. Her husband had been a miner, but he had retired. He'd got bad lungs, and she was called Grandma. Everybody called her Grandma, and by association he was called Grandad, but I don't think he was as fond of kids as Grandma was. And all us kids, when our mothers were busy or otherwise engaged, if anything happened, if we fell over or whatever, we all ran to Grandma. And Grandma was a real good educator. She was a real old-fashioned, hard-working lady, and she'd pick you up and scrub your knees with a bit of Dettol or something like that, And she was a big influence in my early life. My best friend lived next door to Grandma Dyer. He was the same age as me, a very gentle boy, and he had a younger brother. I had a younger sister. And one of my most vivid memories is to do with him. His dad was a miner, and their house was so dirty and scruffy. Everybody was spotless. Nobody had got any money, but everybody was spotless except this one particular house. And it was very much tutted over the rest of the street. The ladies would gossip over the fence, and oh dear, it's just dreadful. But I didn't notice that because I was only about 3 or 4. And we played happily together in and out of each other's houses. And one particular day, I was in their house, and we were playing quietly, and he'd got a spider, a toy spider on a wire, and I was terrified of spiders. And he was waving this spider at me, so I shrieked and buried myself in the corner of this settee, and all I can remember really is the smell of this awful smell, this urine smell on this settee, and shrieking my head off. And his mother, who was a really meek lady as usual, came in saw that I was so frightened, and she flipped, totally flipped. And she set about him, thrashed him with this wire spider, and I mean, the kid was terrified because she was such a gentle woman as a rule. I ran shrieking out of the house, straight across to Grandma Dyer's, and I said, Grandma, you'll never guess what's happened. May's beaten Lee, it's just awful. And she said, bear in mind I was only a preschool, and she said, that's because that's what happens to her. Sorry.
No, take a moment.
Perhaps this wasn't a good idea.
No, if you want to stop and...
No, I just suddenly remembered it. And he was a lovely man when he was sober, but for the 3 days after he got paid, he was paralytic, and he used to come home and knock stuff and bells out of her. And she'd always got bruises. And now I think about it, the children as well.
And that was the first you knew when you were a child?
Yeah, but obviously, I mean, Grandma told me, she didn't go into graphic details, but she said that's because that's how she feels. And I sort of stored the information, obviously, and never looked at it until now. But after one particularly, where I was going with this story was nothing to do with that. After one particularly bad beating, she'd got a broken arm, and her face was mashed. It was black and blue, and one eye was completely shut. They had to cut her rings off in hospital because her hands were so battered. And that was a rare thing as well, for somebody to go to hospital. My mum was actually a nurse, and if anybody had any problems, it was call for Mrs. Marriott, and she'd go round and patch them up, and people just didn't go to the doctor or the hospital. But she was so badly battered. Mum said, you've got, because we had a cronky old van, which was the only vehicle on the street, I think. I'll take her to hospital, you've got to get her seen to. Anyhow, where I was going with this story was, I was vaguely aware that there were dark mutterings among the ladies, and they were surprised nobody had been and visited him. Anyhow, about 3 or 4 weeks later, 2 chaps came from the pit, and there was a lot of shouting and bawling and going off, and the kids were sent out, and they came over to our house. Grandma Dyer had sent them. Anyway, another couple of chaps went in, and it all went quiet. And then after that, he was walking around with various bruises, and so he'd been, sorted, but it didn't really make a lot of difference. But I think he was ostracised from the sort of the community a little bit after that, and he did leave the pit. I don't know what became of them because we moved house shortly after that. Whew, blimey. Anywho, then I started school, and I can't remember why, but for some reason I didn't. Oh, yes, I do remember why. I did start school in the local little school where all the kids from Gedling and outside of Carlton went. And then there was some structural problem. I think the roof fell in or something. I wasn't very old, and I'd only been there for a term. But anyway, whatever, we were all divided up and sent to different schools all around the area. So I ended up going to one that was closer to Nottingham. And there weren't that many miners' kids there. Obviously, I'd still got my friends at home. But my mum was quite well educated. She'd gone to grammar school, and after my first term, she was a little bit concerned because I was just as thick as 2 short planks, couldn't read, couldn't do sums or anything. So she's a little bit worried about this, and her aunt I don't know where she lived, but it was a real mining community, a real old mining community. And she'd been a teacher. She was retired, but she'd been a teacher. So I was dispatched in the next half-term holiday to spend a fortnight with Auntie Ruth to learn to read. And down from the attic came these Janet and John books and a big bag full of those little shells that you probably didn't, but we did. Little shells you used to use for counting. And so every day she taught me to read. And she did a good job, actually, because I could read when I went home after a fortnight and count and everything. And I'm dyslexic. That's what was the matter with me. And I'm even worse with numbers. I don't know what you call it with numbers, but I'm even worse. But anyway, I'm all right now. So, but the thing with that is, Uncle Roland was a miner. And they lived in a house that had got 2 stories off the street. It was a old cobbled street, a dead end, but 3 stories at the back. So the coal would be delivered on the front of the street, the hatch would be lifted and the coal went straight down into the cellar. But the cellar was also the kitchen. Does that make sense? Because there was 3 stories at the back. So you went in at street level and then you went down the steps into what was the cellar, but it was actually the kitchen as well. Weird. Through the back door, there was a little yard with the usual toilet and what have you. And then through the back gate, almost into the pit yard. So that's the way Uncle Roland went to work. And I remember while I was having my lessons there, they had a bath put in. And the bath was put in next to the cooker, which was 3 foot away from the coal heap where it had dropped down from the... So Auntie Ruth had put a curtain up by the cooker. So you'd be laying in the bath behind this curtain, looking at a pile of coal and smelling the bacon and eggs or whatever was being cooked. But it was weird. Everybody lived in each other's houses. Everybody seemed to be related to one another. And Uncle Roland was a real card because he was a very big man. He was over 6 foot and very broad. He was also a Jew and a bit of a spiv, really. He'd got, although he was a miner, he'd got fingers in all sorts of pies. If anybody wanted anything, they'd come and knock on Uncle Roland's door and you could get it. But he was just such a nice man. And he was one of those people that everybody liked. On the opposite side of the road lived his Auntie Lily. She was a Jewess and she was... again, a big woman, but nobody liked Auntie Lily. She ran a greengrocer's shop out of her front room, and we kids absolutely loved her because at the end of the day she'd shout "kids" and we'd all come screaming along from, miles away, I'm sure, and she'd give you a quarter of an orange or a bit of banana or a piece of apple. We thought she was marvellous, and it wasn't until years later that I realised that what she'd done at the end of the day, she'd get all the fruit that had got rotten bits on or what have you, chop the rotten bits off. They went to feed the pig because everybody had a pig, and she'd give us kids the good bits. Because it was nearly going off, it was always really sweet and juicy, and we thought she was marvellous. But all they had also go, "That Lily, she never wastes a bloody thing." You know? So
is that why you think she was not perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. And she got quite a bit of money as well because she was really careful, you know. And she was the only greengrocer's shop in the area. You'd got to go to Auntie Lily if you wanted greengrocery because, oddly enough, and I don't know why, I do, they'd got no gardens. I was going to say the other mining communities I've worked in, people grew their own, but where Auntie Ruth and Uncle Roland lived, they'd got no gardens.
Had they got allotments?
That's what I'm wondering. I'm not aware of allotments. I can't imagine Uncle Roland digging anyway, so that's perhaps why I wasn't aware of any allotments. But usually there are allotments and gardens and things, and I just can't bring any to mind. There was a rag and bone man with a pony. And I think the milkman had a pony and cart when I first started going down there as well. I don't remember any green spaces at all. Because out the back, as I say, you went straight onto the pit yard. There was railway tracks and tub trucks and all sorts chugging up and down.
You don't remember seeing anybody walking around with spades? And
I don't, no, I don't. And usually there'd be somebody trundling about with a wheelbarrow full of veg, you know, coming up from the allotment, as you say, on a weekend morning, but not there, no. Certainly when I lived at Carlton, at the same time, obviously I didn't live with Auntie Ruth and Uncle Roland, other than holidays. Everybody had got a garden at Carlton. Most people grew.
Where did your auntie get her fruit and veg from then?
Auntie Lily.
Oh, right. No, I mean, for her shop, where did she...
Oh, gosh, I don't know.
Did you ever see anyone delivering anything? Or?
No, Auntie Lily had got an old pony and trap. And she used to go and fetch it in, but it would be early in the morning before those kids would be up. So, I don't know. That's weird. Another thing I'd not thought about until just.
So when you used to go to school, can you remember sort of whereabouts or the name of the school even, possibly?
The one I ended up at was Standhill Road Infant School. But I think I started out... I can't remember. It was down in Netherfield. I've got Chandos Street in my head. But whether that was the name of the school or not, I don't know. The building where the roof fell in, I remember that being used for the boys' brigade meetings. And that was part of the original school, but I can't remember the name of it.
No, that's okay. It might come to you eventually at some point. So when you were at school, and that was Gedling, am I right?
Yeah.
So then did you move again after that and come in, or was that the community where you sort of grew up?
No, that's why I've not got an awful lot of sort of childhood mining memories, because I'd only be about 6, possibly 7 when we moved. No, I think 6 actually. And we moved to Arnold, which there's not... Although again, on the outskirts of Gedling, there isn't the same amount of mining community there.
So we were talking earlier about moving into a mining community from as an outsider. Have you got any specific memories of what that was sort of like? Were you welcomed, or was it difficult?
Well, at that time, I was just married, so I'd be maybe 22 or 3. Perhaps a bit older, can't remember. And we moved into Annesley Wood House. We moved to the bottom end of the village where it was mostly retired older miners down there. And it's really hard to move to be an incomer into that sort of community. I think it is in any community. Any small community, you're viewed with a certain amount of... People are polite, but closed. And they wait and see how you turn out. You're like on probation for a little while. In a way, we were quite lucky, because the reason we moved to Annesley... Oh, it was Annesley Woodhouse, actually. But the reason we moved there was because my mum had retired just after we got married. We were living in a horrible little rented house at Pinkston, and my mum had got her own house, retired through ill health, and my husband at that time was a a brickie, so it seemed like a good idea to sell Mum's house and see if we could buy her a smaller place and perhaps, see if we could get her a bit of capital to make her retirement a little bit easier. Anyhow, long story short, we found in Annesley Wood House 3 cottages, 2 of which were due to be demolished within a week. The guy had them on the market for a long time. The lady that had owned them had died, left them in a state of ill repair anyway, and they'd been condemned by the council. There were 3-storey buildings. In fact, I don't think 2 of them were cottages thinking about it. I think it was part of an old oast house. And they should just been allowed to go to rack and ruin, and 3 stories high, and they were dangerous, and the council had said they'd got to come down. The other cottage was a weaver's cottage originally, so it had got low windows upstairs. Now I'm digressing, sorry. Anyhow, that one was livable in with a little bit of repair. So the plan was we'd buy the 3 cottages with Mum's money, do the good one up for Mum to live in, more or less straight away, and then take the top story off the other building and turn that into 2 cottages to sell. Sounds like a good plan. So we did that. We got the place. Mum, funnily enough, went to stay with Auntie Ruth and Uncle Roland for a couple of weeks while we got the house ready for her. She came back. And my sister was living with her at the time as well. So all 3 of us pitched in and got that house ready. And then my husband, with me as labourer, set about the 3-storey one. We got them really cheaply because, as I say, they were due to be demolished. And because there was a lot of timber to come out of the inside, and bear in mind, people still didn't have a lot of money. This was before miners were getting better wages, but they still weren't getting the good wages that they came to a few years later. So, and these were mostly retired people in our end, so they were always skint. And being an older generation, they also were very frugal. Even if they'd got money, they didn't spend it. So we'd got all this timber coming out of the houses, and my husband had gone to the pub and said, if anybody wants this for kindling, come and fetch it. So that went down quite well. We got brownie points for that, but still you weren't accepted at all. But we got the houses done, and we decided we were paying rent on this horrible little house at Pinxton. So we decided we would get a mortgage on one of the cottages, sell the other one, and that's how we moved to Annesley. So we'd got, at that point, 2 things in our favour. One was that we were quite hard workers. That always goes down in a mining community. And the other one was that we'd let this wood go, and in fact my husband did take some round to the older people who couldn't get out and about, so that went down well. But then the first winter we were there was absolutely horrendous. The village was snowed in. Annesley Wood House is great, or it was in those days, because you'd got shops. Everything you needed was in Annesley Wood House. You didn't need to go anywhere. But there was so much snow that the people on the opposite side of the road to the shops couldn't get across, some of the old ones. So we did shopping in bits and pieces and lit fires, and we're generally good souls, which makes us sound like saints, but we weren't. It's just that's how you lived then. If you lived near an old person or somebody that was ill, you went and helped. So we were lucky, we quickly got accepted, and my husband went to the pub every night as well, which, the Forest Tavern around the corner, that gets you in the dominoes team and the darts team, and then everybody's your best buddy, so that was fine. We had got the Working Men's Club, but the General Havelock and the Forest Tavern, which were just round the corner from us, it was like a ritual. You'd start off in one, go to the other one, and if there were no games of darts or dominoes going off, you'd wander up to the Working Men's Club and perhaps finish off the evening there. The older ladies were still very much like they were when I was a child, you know. They'd still got the pinnies and no teeth in, and quite formidable. They really were. One old lady in particular, her husband had lost one of his legs in an accident. She was really aggressive. And yet, in the war, she'd taken in children, evacuees, and they all came back to see her. She'd got no children of her own. And she was such a grumpy old bat. But she must have been a good person to these kids, because they all used to come back and see her. What else can I say?
Did you find there was anybody else, because you say you were in your 20s, I think, there. Was there anybody else along your age-ish, or were they also the older ladies?
Down our end, most of us, most of the people that lived down our end were older. They were either retired or coming up to retirement. The guy that bought the cottage that we'd renovated, he came with his girlfriend. She was an art student. He would have been about, 22 or 3, and he worked at Anna's Levanting and was a lovely guy. And they both had lived in a mining area all their lives. But they were new to Annesley, and they took to him really well, but Sarah not so much. And I think, I know it's nothing exotic, but it was to a lot of the older people to think of a lass going to art school. Really? Mm-hmm. And she was very arty, and didn't really want to mix. I think that doesn't help either. So there was them, and then further up the village there were sort of middle-aged people who were miners. There were some real characters. Down our end, a lot of the people again were related, and on our side of the road, just next to the beer off, there was a guy lived there with his wife, daughter and son. The son hadn't gone down the pit. I can't remember where he worked. I know the daughter worked in one of the factories in Sutton. Anyhow, he'd only got, the guy had only got about 3 years to go before he retired, and he devoted himself to spending as much time on the club as possible in the next 3 years. We lived next door to the doctors. Again, people didn't go to the doctors a lot, but you had to go to the doctors to get your club note signed. And our senior doctor was an old man, a Dr. Rickett. He'd been in the RAF. He was a lovely old guy. But he knew the miners inside out. And on a Monday morning, he'd go through the waiting room and go, you and you can go home and go to work. And anybody else that's come for a sick note, if you're not really ill, you might as well go now. And then he'd go straight into his consulting room. So this guy that I'm talking about had worked that one out, and he didn't go for his sick note until Tuesday when Dr. Ricky wasn't on. But he was quite open about the fact that he was going to do as little work as possible until he retired. He was a nice chap, and he was one of the local characters. He'd take his dog for a walk every day and stop and talk to nearly everybody in the village. And that was another thing that got us accepted as well, because it was a little Jack Russell, and because we had animals, it's this thing again, isn't it, where the community sort of, like, people went to my mum because she was a nurse, and they'd come to my husband because he was a builder if anything, if they needed a hand with anything. Anyhow, Barbara this chap's wife had seen that the little dog's, one of its claws was curling round into its paw, and she tried to cut it, and the dog had screeched. So on one of his constitutionals, he said to me, "Now then, lass, Bar says you can cut our dog's claw. Shall you come tonight?" And that was it. Off he went. So I went. And because, I suppose it's like children, because it was a stranger doing it, the dog was as good as gold. I chopped his claw off, did the others, and that was that. And I came away with a carrier bag that had got a stew in a casserole dish, and another carrier bag that was full of runner beans from the allotment, the inevitable allotment, and a bottle of his homebrew beer. And that's how it was. If you did somebody a good turn, you repaid them. Very rarely in money. You would very rarely get money. We had chickens, and obviously you get cockerels when you have chickens. So we reared them, and my husband would dispatch them. I used to pluck and dress them, and people would have them. Sometimes you'd get paid in money, but very rare. Usually it'd be quite often vegetables, or you might get helped out in some way. If one of the chaps, he was between jobs. He had been a miner. I think he retired through ill health. But he was a bit of an odd job man. Anyhow, if he had anything, he would give, because my husband, as I say, was a builder, he'd give my husband a few hours' work. And it sort of chopped and changed about. If somebody up the street knew a bit about cars and did your car, you'd give them some eggs or whatever. And that's not that long ago, really. It's weird, isn't it? It was so different. So
did
different.
most people have sort of animals? You were talking about animals. Did most people sort of keep chickens and things?
No. It was... They all, without fail, all said, "Oh, we used to have chickens," and "Oh, we always had a pig," because that was the other thing as well. When I was, obviously not at that age, but when I was younger, people had pigs. It just was one of those things. And I always loved the pigs. I couldn't work out where they kept disappearing to every autumn, but I must have clicked on eventually. And but that seemed to die out. I don't know why, but by the time we went to Annesley, people didn't have, but they all remembered having had a few years previously chickens and pigs and what have you, and we had a few sheep as well. So when they went off to the slaughterhouse, there was always plenty of people wanted a joint of lamb or, pork or what have you.
Did you have quite a lot of land with those cottages?
No, we rented land across the road. Kodak had just set up their factory there quite a short time before we moved in. So several of the younger people that would have gone down the pit went to work for Kodak. And we rented some land from them. It was just across the road from us. And everybody kept an eye on the sheep or whatever. If anything untoward happened, there would be somebody about that would knock on the door. There was also a real character, not necessarily terribly well loved, because he was a belligerent bloke and always looking for a fight. He was a miner. He was quite a militant sort of chap. And this is quite interesting, I guess. He was also a bit of a poacher. He used to set traps, and when you'd see him early morning, he'd be walking up with his dogs and a couple of rabbits or a pheasant or something that he'd picked up as he walked round. And he was an aggressive sort of guy. The funny thing is, the guy that was doing his best not to do any work before he retired, to all intents and purposes, you'd think he was quite a jolly sort of chap. He was very rotund and looked soft and as if he wouldn't say boo to a goose. But he was one of the ones that the poacher chappie, for what I'm not going to name him, although it is in the public domain, had respect for. And if he needed squaring up a little bit, it was this other guy that would do it, which always seemed weird to me. But anyhow, when the strike came, the poacher, for want of a better word, was very militant, very vocal. We classed them as our miners. We were very proud of them because they worked through the strike. They worked. There was only one or two in the village that didn't, and he was one of them. He was very, very vocal, very unpleasant, and was constantly to be heard shouting scab. He was always on the picket lines, and in fact he was sacked for fighting on the picket lines and causing trouble. He always said it wasn't him, but I can't believe that. Anyhow, this just shows you the depth of the feeling, because it was a horrible time. It really was a horrible time. You didn't know if people that you were talking to were for or against the strike. People were so rabid about it, you know, it really was a big, big thing. If he hadn't been so unpleasant, I think the community would have helped him, because they did help other people that were on strike. But he was so unpleasant, nobody helped him. And he ended up, as I say, losing his job, and I think his wife left him. Whatever. Anywho, he ended up living on his own with very few friends. But many years later, probably as much as 20 or more years later, he had a blazing row with his neighbour, who had been a miner. I mean, obviously, this far afterwards, there weren't miners then. But he had a blazing row with his neighbour and was killed, stabbed to death. And the minute it happened, the press and quite a lot of people were up in arms and saying, oh, it's all, you know, come back from the strike, this has been I don't think it had. I think the guy that actually did the deed was a nutter. It is my personal feeling. He had been a miner, and he had been a working miner, but he'd lived next door to this guy for years. They hated each other with a passion. They'd had a blazing row on the night that the murder happened. And the guy then had gone on the run, and he'd got several dens set up in the forest around Annesley. It's just not normal behaviour. So I think he'd sort of flipped, and he was generally a nutcase. It took the police ages to find him. I mean, months to find him. It was a long drawn out case. And the guy that lived next door to those two said to me, I don't think it's a case of revenge from the strike. I think it is they'd had a real bad row, one of many, and this guy just had enough and stabbed him. But not just stabbed him, you know, sort of really mangled him. It was a real gruesome murder.
Was this actually at his house?
Yes, yeah. They'd had a row in the pub, both come home drunk, and then the whole street had heard the row between them, maybe around midnight, early hours of the morning. And then he'd been found the following day in a pool of blood. And we didn't live there at the time, but it was in all the newspapers, and as I say, we spoke to several people that we knew that were in the area at the time. And it was a big funeral. Arthur Scargill went, because he was one of the militant miners, you know, and it was, the press had a field day, because it was all supposed to be originated in the strike, and how the strike had still
Was it a church?
Oh yeah,
was
yeah.
that actually in the village? Or?
There was. I don't know whether there still are, but there were 3 churches. There was a Wesleyan, Baptist, and just a normal Methodist church. And then right up on the hill above Annesley, rather than Annesley Woodhouse, there's a big C of E church, and it was up there. That's where, if you were having a posh do, you went up there. And there were a lot of people there. I mean, a lot of the miners that did strike came, and it was a big. But it was really bitter. One of the union men had found out that the bus driver. God, this is dreadful. The bus driver that drove a coach party from wherever to the funeral had actually been a striking miner, and it caused such aggravation. And I think, God, it's all those years ago. Sad, really.
Can you remember when you were going back to the strike that you mentioned, where you said your miners were?
Yes.
They were very proud. Can you remember roughly what sort of year that was? Or?
No. No, I can't remember. I can't remember. I remember there was that pride there because they were working and they were determined to work, and they felt it was the right thing to do. And that's when the UDM started off, wasn't it? But there was sadness as well, because the coal fields were divided, and obviously they didn't like crossing the pickets. But the determination was there to do it. And as I say, they did help the striking miners in the main. They were supported, even though it was the working miners that were supporting them.
Can you remember roughly how many people were at the pit? Was it sort of half striking and half not, or?
Oh God, no, not in our area. No, the majority, as I say, there was only 1 or 2 that were on strike, and people respected their decision to strike, except for the guy that was so belligerent and unpleasant. And I think people excused him as well, because he'd always been belligerent and unpleasant. It wasn't a new thing. You would have expected him to be vocal in his disapproval, let's put it that way. But they just felt it wasn't the right decision for them. And I think also there was, underlying all that, the fact that it was inevitable that the pits would go. Whatever the miners did, it wouldn't make any difference, and I think they knew that. And also, the wages were good then. You know, in that few years previous, the wages had come up, and they were good wages. So you perhaps wouldn't have wanted to lose that income, because you very quickly get used to having that disposable income. And then after that, of course, it became the norm to take redundancy. Again, the payouts on the redundancy were big, and a lot of the miners that we knew took the redundancy and turned it into what they'd always wanted to do. An example being, further up the village, there was an old lady had a haberdashery shop, an old-fashioned shop, sold hair grips and ribbon and cotton and what have you. And she stayed there until she died. She was in her 90s. Anyhow, the old shop, the family wanted to sell it, so my husband bought it and turned half of it, split it into 2 shops because it was a biggish shop, turned half of it into a chemist shop. The local chemist bought that. And the other half, it wasn't half, it was like a quarter of the shop, so it was quite a small unit. But where I'm going with this story is, one of the miners that had taken redundancy wanted to open up an aquarium shop. It was his hobby, it was his wife's hobby, and it had always been his dream to do it as a living. So he bought that little unit, and I don't think they ever made a vast amount of money, but he did what he wanted and he enjoyed it. And there were several of them. One started up doing cars, but I don't think he did very well. And another one, really weird, he'd married an osteopath, and he took a course in massage and nail technician, like doing the acrylic wraps. There were silk wraps in those days, but doing that sort of thing, which is a weird thing for a big burly bloke he was, with a shock of this black hair, and you think the last thing in the world that you would imagine him doing was applying silk nail wraps. But anyhow, that's what he spent his redundancy on, and the osteopath's practice was really in a front room, and they got some proper consulting rooms in Clay Cross, and they did quite well. And he said, yeah, that's the thing. I'd gone to see his wife because I'd got a bad back, and before she did the treatment, he used to give you a 20-minute massage to loosen your muscles, blah blah blah. Anyhow, so I'm having a massage, and we're generally chatting away, and how are you and how's things, and really busy. Could do with taking somebody else on. I said, so and so in the village is looking. He says, I'm not taking an ex-miner on. They never want to work. Which I thought was a bizarre thing to say. Probably unkind and unfounded. But there was a lot of people that took the redundancy and thought it was going to last them for years, which it doesn't, obviously. And so a lot of people were a bit disillusioned when the money ran out. And then there were one or two who'd had accidents, who'd got a bit of money to spend, some of them wisely and some of them just thought it would last forever when it runs out, and then people are very disillusioned and bitter.
How did you feel about sort of when the strikes were going on? How did that sort of affect you particularly a lot, or how did you feel?
I think it affected all of us, really. As I say, you were never sure who you were talking to. You were never sure if they were going to be rabidly for or rabidly against the strike. There were flying pickets, and so there was always that little bit of, fear's too strong a word, but caution, if you like. You never knew quite what was going to happen, when it was going to happen. You'd just suddenly see a big police presence and think, oh God, now what's happening? Down our end of the village was not so bad, but up the top end, closer to the pits, it was not. You just never knew what was going to happen. So it wasn't a nice time at all. And as I say, everybody was, the working miners were sure they were doing the right thing, but they were subdued and unhappy.
Did you ever, did you feel that sort of affected the social life particularly? Did they still go to the club you were talking about, or did they?
I think everybody was a little bit more careful with money. Nobody really knew where it was going to end, what was going to happen, how long the strike was going to go on, what the actual outcome would be. Whether British Coal would just think, oh, sorry, we're not bothering anymore, and close the pits anyway. So I think everything really was more subdued. The blokes still went to the pub, still played the dominoes and what have you, but yeah, it was more subdued. There was definitely like a cloud over everything.
And how did that change? Presumably that changed when the pit eventually closed. I don't know how many years down the line that was.
Annesley was still working when we left and moved away. So Annesley Benting, that I've got 2000 in my mind as to when it closed. I know Newstead shut in the early 80s. Oh, no, I can't remember.
Did you move very far away from there? Was it sort of work or anything that took you away? Or?
Yes, yeah, it was really. We moved to a farm between Bolsover and Clown. So that's, we moved into another mining area really, but no mining to speak of in the area.
Did you find that people were slightly different, or the mood was different, or was there?
Well, they were striking miners, you see. I've got to go to the light. I won't be a minute.